So, hello, I'm Erin. I am really just comfortable identifying as an alcoholic, addict, depending on the room I'm in. It doesn't define who I am, but I've come to really not worry so much about the label part of it as much as what I'm doing about the problem. And I try to keep noise to a minimum around me, but the cats got into my office. They're not allowed in here typically because during the day, eh, so they're having a field day. If it's noisy, sorry, because I can't get them out either. So, uh, let's see. I don't even know. I used to start with when I would do a speaker meeting, start with like my sobriety date and the whole, and again, I kind of came up in the AA, just the AA style of doing things. So I don't really know how, with kind of the way that my recovery has sort of evolved. To me, that's become a lot less of a I don't know milestone, and more of like a reference point. But I'll say that I have about 15 months sober now. And if it tells you anything, the first time I got sober was in 1992. So it's, we've been through a process, a journey, and I'm grateful for it. I can't say, I'm not one of those people that's like, I'm grateful to be an alcoholic. I'm glad all the traumatic shit happened. No, I'm not going to say that, but I will say that I'm grateful to know what I know today about myself, and to be able to use that for personal growth. Because I kind of thought like at some age you stop growing up or something. Like I kind of thought that when I was younger, and then I see Steve, and I'm like, no, you never stop growing up. No, I'm kidding. Kind of kidding. Look at him in his hat. He looks like a kid. But when Steph asked me if I would do it tonight, I was more than happy. And, partially just because um, I have a pretty strong routine, strong being like pretty consistent of going to, three of my home group meetings a week, and then maybe one extra one, but not really having the luxury that I used to have of like being here during the day or popping in as much. Um, I'm really shitty at like not getting caught multitasking. And so I'm always like terrified that I'm going to be like on this work call over here and listening over here, but I'm gonna mess it up. I haven't perfected the Stephanie method of this this working from home thing. But I'll say that Stephanie is somebody that if I can do anything that she asks, I will. And one of the reasons for that is, that Stephanie and I have had a real opportunity over the years to get to know each other as as sisters in sobriety. And I and as much as all the nice things she said about me in the promo or whatever you want to call it, I feel like I feel the same way as far as deeply, and that she's been there as much, as at least as much as I've been there, for her. And I'll kind of go into that portion of the how I came to know that a little bit. But I'll tell you in a general way that I was raised by an alcoholic love addict. That's kind of who my mom was. And she also had, eating disorders and a lot of the other things that come along with the fact that she was borderline, diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which in and of itself isn't necessarily, indicative of any one of those things. It seems to kind of come with that cluster combination of, just really needing to have it proved to her that she had self worth. And I don't know. So I was kind of taught that, like, if someone else found you valuable, then that was, some kind of indicator that you were, and only then, only then, and only through praise. Like, if you were failing at any point or needing help, well, then, you failed your mark. So, that's kind of where some of my ideas about relationships and about just love came from. But I know that my mom loved me, and I know that everything that everything that we went through was really, a lot of it was a result of some generational shit that just hadn't been handled. And anyone who's raised kids or is raising kids, raise your hand if you don't think that you've passed along some generational shit. I mean, what even with my own kids being adults, the layers of that onion peeling back, they are kind to me about it, but we've been able to have a lot more frank discussions about, some of my shortcomings, and instead of making excuses for them, or, like, I did the best I could crying, because that's kind of where I immediately like feel like going, is like, are you fucking joking? Did you know what my life was like, type of thing. I really try to listen to, ways uh, that, I can validate them, and so that we can have a better relationship. Because one thing I'm seeing that I really have to say I'm impressed with is the younger generations, and even some of us older folks, being a lot more comfortable with choosing our family, and literally cutting off people that don't that just are not good for our lives, whether they're family, whether whatever it is. And as much as I know that's sad and hard to do, I wish that I had had some affirmation that it was healthy to put a little bit more distance between, myself and, say, my mother, for instance, or any other part of the family. But we moved to the West Coast from the middle of things, Indiana, where I don't know what else to call it but the middle, when I was a baby. And so I was raised in San Diego. I was raised kind of by the beach, and kind of that coastal living, kind of cool vibe, little valley girl stuff going on. The 70s and 80s and 90s was kind of my growing up period. And I'll say that, I started to, I guess it was during my mom's third marriage. None of them were my dad, by the way. She was married 5 times, never to my father, but that's another night. So, so by the third marriage, which was the longest one I had witnessed up to that point, where he had sort of acted as my dad from like 5 to 13, and also, was abusive and all these other things. Um, I had started to exhibit some, I guess, acting out type of, nothing that I look back on and think like, wow, that was really out of control, wild. I would lock my kid up too, type of thing. But I started being institutionalized around age 12. I started, kind of being taken out of school and put in a psychiatric unit. And back then, in the mid to late 80s, the laws were very different about that. They've actually changed them because of the fact that back then parents could literally just check you in because they said so. And then they had to keep you and diagnose you with something to keep you and medicate you, having met you, 12 hours ago, and all of this. So that kind of started my sort of journey into institutionalization, and feeling like getting really comfortable with that. I was hospitalized in that way no less than um, 10 times between the ages of 12 and 14, 15. And those were just psychiatric stays. I didn't know anything about drugs. I wasn't into drugs at that point. That's not why I was there. I didn't, I didn't have like unaliving ideation, anything like that, until I started going to those places and started learning about things like that from kids that were a lot more troubled than myself in those ways, right? And so it really, all it did was sort of expose me to some of those things I hadn't thought of yet. And some of the way, I mean, we would sit around it, just the way you would talk. It was like, well, don't do it like this. You got to do it like that. Like there was, there was a lot of that, which I won't go into detail about the, examples, but I mean, you can imagine that, you learn a lot of things that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise learned. They were like, in order to get out of the facility for any length of time, like during the week, when they went to CA or NA or AA, like you could choose to go with. Um, and I would, I had no idea, but I wanted to go with my friends. And that was, my first exposure to that was around age 12. So it was, I don't know, it's just kind of an interesting thing. But it really damaged sort of my social the social aspect of my life, because I spent most of my middle school years and my high school years institutionalized, and coming back from being institutionalized and going usually to a different school. Sometimes not, but back then it was not at all popular to tell your friends that you'd been in a psych unit. There was no grippy sock jokes. There was none of that shit. You didn't say things like that. There was nothing, yeah. So that's another way I'm glad that things have really progressed, honestly. Because I like inappropriate jokes, and if you can't joke about something, even if it's to make someone else feel more comfortable, then I don't know what you're doing with life. But back then, there was all it would do is make someone think that you were, you shouldn't come over when their parents find out and things like that. So I was always like re-entering this, these social atmospheres that I already had a lot of anxiety about. The first time I did take a drink, I was 14 years old, and I was hanging out at a friend's house, and she was somewhat popular, and I was kind of in with this kind of popular crowd during this period of time. And her older brother and his friends bought us alcohol. And, who knows why you'd buy a bunch of young girls alcohol. But, I didn't really get to find out, although some of the other girls did. Because I got really, really sick from the first drink I ever took. I could feel all the things that I still today associate with uh, sort of the phenomenon of setting off that craving or setting off that obsession. I mean, the physical sensations, the all of it. And I all of a sudden felt like I always wanted to feel my whole life. And I just didn't, I had no idea how shitty I felt about myself until I drank. And all of a sudden I felt funny and engaging and popular. And my fear of what other people thought of me, of course it was there, right? But as we know, mood and mind altering substances just change our perception of things, right? So it didn't go away. It didn't like work on it at all. It just kind of masked it. So, that night I drank until, and Sarah, I don't think Sarah's here now or yet, but she was asking me if there was going to be vomiting, because every one of my stories that are really epic has vomiting in it. So if she doesn't come, just know that we can tell her there was a vomiting story. So first time I drank, got so sick. I was slept on the bathroom floor in this girl's house, and it felt so good. Like that's how sick I was tile or linoleum or whatever it is was cool, and I was like, I'm never leaving from this spot. But also I was bargaining, right? It was my first real interaction with like bargaining with alcoholism and being like, oh my God, like who does this? I will never do this again. I thought I was gonna die. I didn't know if you could. If I was gonna, I was kind of hoping I would maybe. I also was like, well, if I don't die, don't let my mom find out. Like that would be good. Um, and I was sick all night and swore that I would never do it again if God let me live. And those were about the only prayers I said for a really long time in my life. But the next morning, the sun came up, the birds were chirping, those motherfuckers. You know that feeling if you've been up all night for any reason, when you hear those birds chirping, it's not okay. But you'd be mad at some birds. But by the time my mom picked me up from this sleepover at like noon, because had stopped vomiting, felt a little bit better, not great. Still felt like hammered shit, but my mom couldn't tell or didn't betray if she did. On the way home from this experience, I was trying to figure out how I could do it again. Like that in and of itself, like really in a nutshell, explains what my drinking and my drug use was like. Um, because I hated it, but I needed it. And of course, we know, because of the neuroscience that we know now, we know that like it affects our dopamine, serotonin levels. Like our brain does start to need this substance because whatever. So I didn't understand all of that. All I knew was that I no longer at some point felt okay with myself um, if I wasn't drinking or using. And I always had to hang out with older people. I had been the summer before that happened, within a few months of that happening, I was assaulted by a family member. And I won't go into detail there, but it's an important part of my story because um, the family found out it was a mess. But it was because he went to a family member, and I think he was afraid I was going to tell. And this was a cousin that was about 16, I was 13, and told all about how I had come into his room. I mean, just anyway, it was the humiliation of, now my grandmother knows, my aunt knows, like my mom, and they all believe somehow that I orchestrated this thing that I've never even kissed a boy at this point. Was just it was my first real um, experience with shame on a level that and I'll dip out of this. I just when I cry a little bit and then I keep going. It was my first experience with shame that wasn't mine, taking on shame that didn't belong to me and really deeply internalizing it because of what other people thought of it. My grandmother was the most special person in my life, and I spent every summer with her from the time I was about 8 until that summer when I was 13. And I flew unaccompanied minor. Like she was my adult, she was my person, and the time I spent with her in Indiana during the summer was a reprieve from just a really abusive, shitty household. So the fact that this person that I thought hung the moon, as sometimes it's said, maybe believed that I was whatever I was assigned at that point, was just devastating to me. And I don't think I could ever look my grandmother really in the eye again directly. My mom would bring it up during times throughout my, teenage years of like, well, like, she just wasn't a well person, and so, she would bring it up as like, "Hey, look at this thing you did," and, it wasn't seen for whatever reason as assault regardless of how it occurred. So, I started drinking more after I got home that summer because I went home early. Uh, I was sent home early, which was also, I don't know, it's hard to describe what that was like, but, um I started hanging out with guys that were, that lived in my, apartment complex that were like, 25, 26, 30. They had alcohol. Um, and in that, I had experiences that I wouldn't have had if I wasn't there. And, I kind of chalked most of that kind of stuff up to that. So, was I assaulted by, yes, by the idea that we're not capable of consent at that age when you have such an age difference, right? Like I fully, until I was an adult and had my own children, did not feel like I had been taken advantage of in that way because I was on board. But now what I know is that alcohol was at play, drugs, that type of stuff. And pretty soon I was smoking marijuana, and then um, I became an almost daily LSD user when as I was going into my junior year. I kind of had my first like real heartbreak right before then. I just A lot of things were happening where I liked the dissociation, especially of hallucinogenics and stuff like that. And I liked that, at least for me with LSD, that I still had some control over my faculties, whereas some of the other ones, like there was no telling. And so and look at me, I'm normal, and I used LSD for daily for a long time. No, I'm kidding. That became just part of my lifestyle, with dissociation, and was in high school and met a boy that I really was super head over heels over because he had a skateboard and a dead Kennedy's tattoo. And like, what else is there? He also was super broken, and his mom was in prison for methamphetamine trafficking, which I thought, well, surely like that's just her deal, like, and poor thing, like how can I take care of this guy? Which is not the first pattern of that in my life. And I've only really recently, over the last year or so, been able to break free of that need and desire at all. But that was my first experience with that, and it turned out that he had the same meth connections, and he was actually carrying on family business. And so that was my first exposure to methamphetamines. And then I had a lot of exposures to methamphetamines from that point, because my boyfriend had it everywhere and in amounts that, I mean, you didn't have to cook it up in your house. It would come, I try to be careful about details. I know this is dopey, but also I don't want to be like, and it was the best meth ever. But I mean, like, it was pure, it came from Mexico, like directly. And it was just, it was what it was. And it's not the same as the 90s today, with the quality and what's out there and how scary it is, the supply, all of it. But I developed a methamphetamine habit pretty quickly, and did some really crazy shit as a result of that. I'll tell you one dopey story. This has to do with vomiting as well. I'm still looking for Sarah, but she's just going to have missed the vomiting stories. But these, I think she's heard. One of my most epic, the last time I ever used LSD, I had just turned 16, and this was right before I hooked up with meth guy, and I was hanging out with this deadhead kid that was really sweet, and he really liked me. And I call him a kid. He was probably like 18 or 19, and I was like 15 going on 16 or something. But I felt kind of bad for him because I knew he liked me, and I knew that I could get drugs from him. So he took me to this guy's house called Grateful Ted. That's how this guy was known. Grateful Ted, and he was like the main dealer for the San Diego area at that time, right? Like he even manufactured some of it. It was wild, and LSD was very, I don't know what it's like today, but it was very inexpensive. It was easy to get, like it was all of that stuff. So he took me to this guy's house, I think so that I would be impressed and whatever, and like him more, which makes me kind of sad because I mean, I knew that. And again, it was one of my that was one of my first experiences with like, was it prostitution? Was it not? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, but I go, I'll explain that a little more. I don't think there's anything wrong with sex work. I do know that I didn't see it that way, even though I knew that I wasn't interested in them that way. And I knew that they were giving me drugs because they were. So that's kind of where, I had to kind of change my thinking about that later of like, yeah, maybe I took advantage of some people while they were taking advantage of me, right? So okay. Um, but I go to this house, Grateful Ted's there. He's like this burn out older guy, like old, like at that time, I don't even know. I mean, I remember him being very old. He might have been like my age now. I don't know. But he was just burnt out and really cool. And he lived in this area of San Diego, which if you're familiar at all, is one of the richest areas there in La Jolla. And they have fancy streets with like cobblestone, like it's bougie, like it's a lot. And they said, oh, well, this is the tray that they dip it in, right? And if you lick a little bit of that, like that's the like concentrate. And I was like, that's all right. And I like, took a big old lick out of that. It was like one of those Pyrex like cake pan type of things. And Grateful Ted came back and he saw like how much of it had been gone through, and he started getting. He was scared. He was seemed like a pretty cool dude, but you could tell he was freaked out. And apparently, you can do too much LSD. I had always been told this myth of like you can't overdose on LSD. You can't. Well, I'll tell you, you can have an experience that makes you never want to do it again. And that's almost, that's what this was. Cause on the way home, I had to make my poor friend, deadhead friend, pull over to one of those cobblestone sidewalks so that I could vomit all over it in front of like the Louis Vuitton store. It was a lot. And that was the first time my mom suspected I was on drugs because I came home, and I don't know about y'all, but we had a vomit pot in our house. Like there was a certain one that like if you're gonna vomit, here's the bowl or the pot or whatever. Um, I don't know, but I've heard a lot of other people have that. So anyway, I thought there were ants in it, and I couldn't be cool. Like I really thought, like you couldn't convince me there wasn't. And my mom and her friend had just come home, and they were toasted. I mean, they were drunk, and I had to tell my mom because I was laying in my bed and I thought, what if I die? Like I really maybe I could die. Maybe I could. And I was like, I have to tell my mom. And within a couple days, I was in the first drug rehab type of program I went to, which was more of a detox, short term. And picked up an AA book. I still have the AA book somewhere. And drew lots of nice little things on it and whatever, but I didn't give a shit about any of that. I had no interest. I did though have an astonishing ability by that point to say what they wanted to hear, because I had been institutionalized so much to that point that I knew what to say to get to say, and I knew what to say to get to leave. And that's just the way it was. So that things kind of progressed, and jumping back into the meth days, um things were really unsafe. I was in a lot of unsafe situations that even my boyfriend couldn't really protect me from once we were in them, because now you're dealing with other people and their you know sickness and defects and whatever. So eventually I became pregnant, and I, I was 16. I had kind of an idea like, well, I mean, I could, keep it, right? And I ended up telling my mother, and she's like, well, if you want help, like if you decide you want to keep it, then cool. And if you don't, then cool. Like, I'm with you, right? And she said, and she revealed to me at that point that she had had a similar experience after I was born with a baby that so we kind of were able to bond over that. I felt a little less bad. And one of my problems at that point was I knew that I couldn't tell her at this time, but I knew that I had been using meth like every day, all day, like every day, all day. And I started freaking out about this um, and the potentiality of what might happen. We had a friend of the family who had a baby that was missing like the left side of its heart because of methamphetamines and didn't live very long. And that never left my mind because they were very close friends of the family, and it was devastating. And I just thought for sure that that was probably what was going to happen. So um, on that piece, I'll say that the part that's pertinent isn't so much that I had to go and walk across picket lines, because I did, um, as a 16-year-old girl who was already really afraid of everything. Um, because my mom, it wasn't that wasn't the most traumatic part. It was the part where a couple days later, my mom and I had gotten into an argument, and she brought it up, and she called me something that indicated that she didn't respect my decision. After she drove me there and like paid for the whole thing. So I left the house, and she told me not to come back, and I didn't. I lived initially from house to house, and then eventually on the streets for about 3 months in San Diego. And you could kind of do that in San Diego because the weather's kind of nice, comparatively. Like some places, you just can't do that. But I lived in a park or dope houses or wherever I could crash. And again, lots of things can happen in those scenarios, and I put myself in a lot of unsafe situations with a lot of people who I had no reason to trust. And um, luckily have over the years come to terms with a lot of the things that happened sort of during those time periods. But it definitely stays with you, and it's a stark reminder that when I lose control, I don't get to decide where that ends. I just don't. I don't. I could end up anywhere with anybody. And so after a couple, 2.5, 3 months on the streets, I called my grandmother because she was the only adult that I trusted, and I knew her number. And I called her from a payphone, and said, I want to come home. Like I want to go home, but my mom wouldn't take my calls, even though she had me reported as a runaway at this point. She wouldn't take my calls. So I knew if I was caught by the police somewhere that they were going to pick me up, put me in juvie because I was a runaway. But also, I had just spent 9 days in juvenile hall. And honestly, I would have preferred that to being on the streets. But either way, my grandmother talked my mother into letting me come home with the caveat that I would go to long-term rehab. And I was going to agree to anything. Absolutely. Yes. Sure. Cool. And the next thing I knew, we were driving into the mountains to a place that my mom's therapist said, this is the treatment, right? Like this is the treatment of the time, a therapeutic community. And it's 12 to 24 months. Like telling a 16-year-old that, like, that might as well be the rest of my fucking life. But I didn't get to call the tune because I had, backed myself into a corner. So up I went, up into the mountains, about 25 miles into what a lot of people don't know there are mountains right in San Diego, but there are. And that's where we ended up at place called Phoenix House. And uh, to say that it was a shocking reality check, I don't even know how to, characterize it. All I know is that the first day I was there, the first time they started a group, we were doing what you call the game, which I found out later, of course, was formulated by an insane cult leader whose cult was featured on Deadly Cults, called Synanon. That program was a direct descendant, and so were a couple of others. And then sprung from there was the wilderness camps that you're hearing more about in the news and stuff with Paris Hilton and such. So anyway, so we were subject to brutal encounter groups where we ripped each other apart, just all the way down to the bone, 3 days a week. With, and it wasn't staff, none of them were trained. It was the kids, it was, ages 13 through 18, just the worst imaginable insults that you can think of were the way that they were supposed to break us down, and the whole idea was breaking down your identity. So I couldn't, I was kind of a goth, like skater kid, so I couldn't wear anything black, like nothing, not socks, not, I mean, they, no makeup, like everything was about, which the concept of this I understand and understood, but it was about stripping you of any like individuality that you have. Now, the initial cult, they did that through like head shaving and, forced vasectomies and steroids, things like that. But you couldn't get away with that and get state funding, right? So we didn't have to do that. But we did have to do a lot of the other shit, like telling our basically what amounts to a fifth step in front of a co-ed group of 42 peers. And this had to be complete sexual history, complete, like all of it, all of it, all of it. Stand up and get it all out, right? Like it's the only way you're not going to end up a dope fiend, which is how we were referred to several times a day by the director. Like you're not going to be anything but a dope fiend if you don't, clean your toilet with a toothbrush, or if you take longer than a 2-minute shower, like you could be, subject to any number of punishments, even like a 3-day silence ban where nobody's allowed to talk to you and you have to work from sun up. Just like it was like unhinged. And the programming was something I couldn't see for a long time. Like people ask, well, why did you stay? Well, and we were 25 miles up a mountain. We're not really sure how we got to start with. I barely know what town I'm in. What am I going to do? I don't do wilderness anyway. Everyone knows this about me. I don't camp. I don't wilderness. So I was not going to be out there fishing or any of that shit that Steph would have been like, well, I'll just fish, right? No. And there were lots of other ways. My mother did try to take me out after about 3 months because she could see that there was nothing behind my eyes anymore. And they told her, because they knew she was an alcoholic, she was going to AA as part of our family plan, so that when I got out, I could go and live with her. They informed her at that time that she had signed over guardianship of me when she brought me there, and that since she was an alcoholic, it was not going to go well for her probably to try to get it back, because they would take her to court, because they were getting funding for me, and that would have messed that funding up. So that was a rude awakening, and she certainly didn't feel empowered. Obviously, she didn't have the money to fight them, and she, any of it. She didn't know it was not legal what they did. It was common practice, and it still is in the treatment industry. It's why I speak out a lot against body brokering and trafficking, because treatment recruiters are almost always body brokers. No matter how you get them there. Like some of the kids at my place were gooned, as they call it, where they were kidnapped from their homes, kidnapped walking home from school, like not knowing who this person is. And of course you find out, but imagine just those few moments of not knowing like the thought of it just blows my mind, of my kids being that afraid for even a minute. But that's kind of the way, they did it however they could do it. And, I'd like to say that was something that I don't know. It's kind of a tricky thing because if you had asked me for a lot of years, probably 20 years, what I thought about that program, what I would have said is what word for word most survivors of that program and others like it say, which is they saved my life. And, it didn't occur to me that the fact that it was word for word what you would hear if anybody asked about any of, well, what about this other shit that happened there? But they saved my life. So that kind of indicated the programming that was going on there. But, in order to, one thing I know that other alcoholics and myself tend to sometimes have a hard time with is more than one thing existing in the same space, right? Like knowing I was abused and also that there was some good stuff I learned there. Like I could not reckon with that, and I couldn't look back on that part of my life. And if you ever want to read more about, the excommunication or any of that, because I won't go real deep into that tonight. I've written about it. I TikTok about it. Like, it's getting, that kind of stuff is becoming more known about, and so more of us are talking about it. But that was a pretty brutal experience because I graduated the program after a year and a half, and eventually in the live out phase, I was excommunicated from all of my friends. But they would isolate you from the rest of the world. So you were told those were the only people that you need and would ever need. And anybody that even did anything that, like if they drank alcohol, even if not alcoholically, couldn't be around them. Like, they were very restrictive. So I had really I had to start from nowhere. And luckily I had been going to NA and was able to get into, some of the meetings there and meet people in AA. But I was pregnant with what turned out to be my first child at that point, and that was part of the reason for the excommunication. But so I was all alone because they had also, when I left there, wouldn't let me live with my mom, and she held it against me that I allowed them to make rules for me, which is kind of ironic if you think about it. And that was cause for a lot of contention for a lot of years between us because I didn't have the support I needed because of just the way that system was so insular and cult like. So, I went through a period of deep grief because these people were my family for more than 2 years. They made us refer to each other as brother and sister. And what I knew was that if when I was there, if anybody left early, like split, if anyone relapsed when they were in the live out phase, any of that, no one was allowed to even speak of them again without a punishment. Like you would get a work punishment for speaking of that person at all. Or they had to literally be scribbled out of photos. I've seen photos of myself that people have from back then that I'm not the only face scribbled out, but like they had to keep scribbling people out, like the trauma of I don't know, man. I can laugh about it a little bit, but it's pretty fucked up if you think about it when it comes to addiction treatment. So um, I basically ran as far as I could away from that part of my life pretty quickly. As soon as I put together about 5 years sober from the time I went into there and had gotten out, I had a couple years on my own. I started separating myself just from a trauma standpoint from that part of my life. So I started separating myself from the fact that I am an addict.
And I thought, well, maybe none of this was true. Maybe none of this happened, right? Maybe the problem wasn't that big, all of that shit. And I had no people that knew me to really consult with about that, to remind me, like, no, man, you were, living on the streets, picking at your skin and shit and sleeping different places. So I ended up with alcohol was kind of how I started back. I thought I can have a drink or two, and I met a normal guy who was really a very safe pick. And we met, while I was trying to get my life together. I was going to school, doing really well, was doing one of those pharmacy tech programs, which back in California paid pretty well for the time, union job, all of that. And on my first job that I was put on, I met a man that was very nice to me, very safe, um, a good bit older, not sugar daddy by any means. He wasn't like rolling in dough. He was secure though, and trustworthy. And I knew something. One thing I knew was he was not going to hurt me. Like I just knew the minute I met him that he was never going to betray me, which was one of my biggest like problems at that point, was feeling the betrayal from various aspects of having been in my childhood, but then carrying on through the betrayal of some of the things that we had to kind of bear about ourselves in that treatment process, and ways that I felt like I should have been protected that I wasn't, as a child. And so betrayal became one of my biggest triggers, and still is today, for just like disengage at done, or even a sense of it. But I started drinking here and there at first, and then I started drinking a lot. And the man that I was engaged to at that time was not much of a drinker, and grew up in Turkey, which was a culture of like drinking wasn't seen as culturally acceptable, and it was kind of looked down on. So he almost looked down on me like, I don't really like that you do that, but I'm like dealing with it. And my wedding night, same scenario. I ended up sleeping on a bathroom floor in my wedding dress, sick as a dog, in the most beautiful hotel, because I started drinking and I couldn't stop. And anytime it occurred to me over the years that, especially when, and it says this in the AA Big Book, right, that we have a knack for getting tight, as they say, at just the wrong times. So, if there was something that required more focus for me, I was getting drunker. If it was something that made me anxious, I really didn't want to get married. But I was telling someone the other day, I once got married because I didn't want to be rude. Like, I had said I would, and then even once I realized, I really don't want to do that, um, I I figured, well, I said I would, so we're doing this thing, and that was like a 16-year marriage. So he did keep me safe. I'll say, for the best of his ability, he really was a safe person, and he took care of a lot of the things that I lacked on as I started drink more and drink more. And my drinking was on the surface controllable, because it was um during certain times, right? I was still able to stay within that time frame of, well, I only drink on the weekends. I don't drink until whatever time of the day, but I was waiting for that time, like stopwatch, like it's time. And then once I started, I didn't know when I was going to stop. And then I could stop for days, weeks, I could stop for months during those years of about 15, I would say 15 years. And to me, that was proof that I didn't have a problem. But of course, my argument with that is that if you have to spend much time thinking about ways that you're not an alcoholic or an addict, you might want to take a look at it. Because what I found out later was most people don't think about stuff like that very much. Like, what? Okay, interesting. So, you know, it turned into what became my more devastating addiction, which was an opiate addiction. Started with prescriptions, all legal, but they were still giving out shitloads of them. And it was, you know, it was before they even had like, you know, that they were even recording it in the DEA records, or, you know, you get them in different pharmacies. I mean, it was very easy to scam drugs. I never bought them off the street or anything like that. I didn't have to, because I was a suburban housewife who nobody thought would be abusing drugs. That's the way it was looked at, you know. So I had carte blanche, and I had some legitimate medical issues, which didn't, you know, it helped for me to get things. It didn't help in the way of my recovery, right? So for about 5 years, that was very different from the alcohol, in that from the time it started, I did not have an off button. I couldn't go a day without it. I couldn't go weeks or months or whatever without it, like I could with the alcohol. It had me from hello. And you know, to quote a movie, we like our movie quotes in here, right, Jeff? But you know, it had me at hello. And it it was so demoralizing, because I was kicked out of pain clinics and had to find a new one and explain some lie story, this and that, about whatever, and doctor shopping and going to the ER knowing I was lying about things. You know, I mean, I was like one step from actually harming myself on purpose to get more, although I harmed myself a lot on accident. So it makes me wonder, maybe some of that was subconsciously, whatever, feeding my habit. But my kids were growing up, and I had two at that point. And the last straw for me in 2013 was that I had run off the road with my younger son in the car. He didn't realize it. He was all good with, you know, whatever, but it scared the shit out of me. And that was the first time I had the thought, oh, I'm not just harming myself, right? It's not just me hurting myself. Like, I could not live with hurting one of my kids. Like, whatever happens to me happens. But that really kind of was a wake up call. It still took me a couple of weeks to really examine it enough to seek help. But I had, funny enough, a woman that my kids went to school with, their mother, that we'd known each other from the PTA. I had heard a couple years prior that she had ended up in rehab. She was a nurse anesthetist, got in trouble. You know, I heard it through the rumor mill. Like, I didn't know anything about it other than that. And I remember feeling very uncomfortable talking about it with other people, just because I knew like that could be me, you know, but they don't know that. So I had seen her the day I ran off the road with my son, that morning at a spelling bee that I was late to because I was fucked up, and then, you know, had to drive an hour and some change back to our town unsafely with my kid. And the funny thing was that when I saw her earlier that day, one thing that struck me about her was that she seemed to be doing really well. Like, she looked vibrant and happy, and we didn't talk about anything about her issues or anything like that, but there was something that stuck in my brain about that. We just had a brief lunch and everyone went their separate ways, and that was that. But a couple weeks later, the day that I woke up and I thought, you know what? I just got new refills, and this is all going to be gone in 3 days, and I am exhausted. Like, by this time, I was exhausted. And I knew that, you know, I should be excited to have these new refills, but all I could think was, what am I going to do when this is gone? Because it'll be gone in 2 or 3 days, like a whole month's supply. And I mean, I wasn't just on a little bit, like they had kept graduating me up and up and up, and you know, oh, panic, just it was insane. And I remember having a distinct thought the last time my doctor had written me a prescription for something that was an add-on drug. I thought, I'm gonna die from this. Like, I'm gonna die from this. I don't know where that came from. I didn't know people that were dying from it personally. It was still, you know, beginning of the pandemic. I mean, the opioid epidemic and whatever. It all feels fucking the same, honestly. But um, so I just knew with a certainty that I was not making it out alive. I was surprised to wake up every morning. And what I knew about powerlessness, at least at that point, was I knew it would be one of my kids that would find me, and that wasn't enough to make me stop. Nothing was. And I've never loved anything as much as I've loved my children. Never could. I just, there's no worse thing you could say to me than, insult than you're a bad mom. Like you can call me all kinds of cunts and whores and I don't give a fuck. But the bad mom thing, like that, that was hard for me to accept, that I was not behaving like a healthy mom. Was I a bad mom? No, but I was a sick mom who knew that she wasn't going to get better on her own, and that my kids deserved better, even if I wasn't sure if I did yet. So the interesting thing is, I woke up one morning, had these new prescriptions. I was looking at them and I did, like I said, I was exhausted, like, no, fuck this. And I had this idea to call the woman that I told you about that was in like the mom circle. Um, we weren't even friends really close or anything. Our kids didn't really like each other even though they'd been in since kindergarten together. But something told me to call her because there was something that, I think it was maybe from being in recovery before, where you can kind of tell somebody who's got that vibe, some of the things they're saying, or you ever meet someone and you're like, oh, they're programmed, right? It was something that made me call her that morning. And I remember I fucked it up too, because I called her and I was like, hey, so I heard that you went to rehab a couple of years ago. And she, like, this is how I start this phone call, right? And I'm like queen bee at this point. I'm like the PTA president and have been for 5 years. So I'm sure in her head, she's like, what kind of gossip are you trying to get here? And she was like, what is this about? And I said, let me back up. I have a problem. And I thought, if she's not in recovery, then I've just outed myself and so be it. But I want to survive. And I said, I have a problem. And I heard that you had a similar one. And from everything I see, you look like you're doing well. And like, I need to know, are you in recovery? Are you someone that can at least point me to somebody who is? Like, I don't know what to do. And I'm afraid of people finding out. I'm afraid of all that shit. And she said, get to the next, AA meeting, because that was the place that had meetings every day. Our NA here locally only has one or two meetings, because if it were up to me, that's where I would have gone, was NA. I felt like I identified more as an addict than anything else. But I started going to this daily AA meeting. And I mean, just the way God puts people in our lives that way is so weird, because I had no reason to know whether she was in recovery or not. But the thought coming into my mind, I knew. And I knew she was my girl when she said, what did you do with the drugs? And I said, oh, I threw them out. And she said, like, threw them out how? And I said, I flushed them. She's like, oh, good. And I said, oh, no, because I know at least that in a couple hours, when I change my mind, I would be digging through the trash. Like, I'm that kind of addict. I'm the kind of addict that would puke up pills and take them again. This is why Sarah loves my puke stories. This is why she always says, will there be puke? Absolutely. And there are people in meetings sometimes when I tell that story, they're like, ew. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I'm glad to know you've never done anything disgusting for drugs, but you probably have. At least it was my own puke, is all I got to say. My own toilet. But, from that moment on, I was in the hands of a higher power. I knew it. I'm not religious. To this day, anyone that knows me will tell you that I have no interest in modern religion or any kind of religion. But yeah, shitting, puking, crying. We used to have dopey story nights that were like themed. Like, we could have a whole segment on Saturdays that would be just peeing stories from people. Wasn't that crazy? remember the days? Oh, bless it. It was the early 60s. So yeah, so there's lots of vomiting, but I went through a really terrible cold turkey withdrawal that I don't wish on my worst enemy. I don't, and I don't know that anybody needs to do it that way. I just didn't know any other way. I didn't know anything about MAT, that just wasn't offered to me, and I was afraid to reach out to my doctor, and I cold turkey withdrew, and I thought, and I remember what one thing I told myself minute by minute, literally, and this sticks with me to this day. If I go through this now, if I get through this now, I never have to do this again. Like I just that was it. That was my only solace, because I had the restless legs and I didn't sleep and I was sweating and puking and whatever. But I knew that it was better than all the days that my kids had to ask their dad, "Why is mom in bed?" She said we were going to Carowinds, which is like, I don't know, Disneyland or some shit like that, amusement park. But mommy's sick and she can't because I was out. Like, I knew that I couldn't live with that anymore and that it was worth it to at least try. I also knew I could go back to using if I wanted to. Like, if it really was that bad, I would do it. Um, but I got a sponsor pretty quickly. I wanted to live, and I did everything that was suggested of me, whether I liked it or not. I was at 2, 3, sometimes more meetings a day. Not everyone can do that. I just had the luxury of that because my job was pretty flexible. But I knew that if I wasn't willing to go to rehab, that I was going to have to work my program like it was rehab, as in, like, follow someone around and let them tell me how to live, because I had a lot of idle time. Most of my using was done while my kids were at school. So I had to find someone to follow around in between meetings and people to hang out with, and I was not that girl. I didn't like to do that. All my friends prior to that were mommy wine friends. I was also prey to that culture, right? That was the beginning of the mommy needs wine, rosé all day bullshit, that is killing women today, but that's another soapbox. So I went through, I went through AA. I'll say that I made one judgment call that I don't know if I would do it differently, if I could do it again, but I'll say that I don't recommend getting in a relationship early in recovery. I don't recommend it. We're all going to do it, have at it. But it didn't really help my recovery. I don't know how I survived it, to be honest. Even the first couple of years were especially volatile, because he had a couple of years sober. um so it was just all not right. It just really put me off track in some ways, but in a lot of ways it kept me close to AA too, so I can't complain. We had a similar aim to do service work. We both were very dedicated to that. We had our own meetings that we would go to, yada yada yada. The fact remains that it didn't give me the space or room to have my own program from the beginning. I kind of lived in the shadow of somebody that people respected in a certain way, that when you saw it behind the scenes, like, wasn't the same. Uh, I'd say I'm pretty much the same person in most places where I am, but not everybody is, and that can be frustrating, right? So I didn't get a lot of support when it came to, hey, this is what's going on, because there were a lot of people that didn't believe, because that's not what they saw, and they had known this person a long time. So we had, ups and downs, years of sometimes great times, sometimes toxic times, but my higher power a lot of the time was this relationship. And my higher power a lot of the time was validation from sometimes doing too much service work. Like, I mean, I all I wanted was to be anything other than mediocre, right? That's I told someone recently, being seen as mediocre is like one of my biggest fucking nightmares. And I know it. I don't want to be seen as great. I don't need to be anything other than what I am. I see Stevie back there crawling the wall. But to not have made an impact and to have helped, like, to me, that's what that means. Like, I want to make an impact that is lasting and leaves something good for other people. And so I could service work the hell out of, I could do that in a sick way too. But I got about 7.5 years, and prior to that, the pandemic happened. A lot of things happened. That's how we all ended up here in this room. And thank God, honestly, that I made the friends here that I made here during the time that I did, because I had been on Dopey for a while and I knew some people, like some of our friends that aren't here anymore and some of our friends that are. But I was able to deepen some of those relationships and really form some partnerships and friendships and sisterhoods and brother, just listen, we sometimes we fight all like brothers and sisters, but familiarity breeds contempt is what what this how the saying goes, and it happens in AA, and it happens it happens anywhere there's a group, especially of people that need to work on themselves a little bit. We all do. Some are sicker than others, but I don't want to talk about Steph right now. So I'll say that a couple things happened. One was that I was used to everyday meetings and stuff like that, and the pandemic just knocked those of us that have been doing a program a certain way for a loop. And this program, this group of people was my biggest social outlet, and I'm grateful for it, because I would still go to my home group meeting 3 days a week, but this was my meeting after the meeting. And I love fellowship. I love getting to know what makes people tick. I love being able to be helpful when I can, and even being told to fuck off when I'm not being helpful, like whatever. I love community. And so there was a period of time where I went sort of further away from that. I think those of us who were used to having home group and some accountability, when we no longer had that, it was very easy to sort of disappear and no one ask any questions, right? Like nobody noticed that you weren't at your home group because they weren't either, type of thing, or you could just phone it in on Zoom. But there were plenty of times that after I relapsed, which occurred around the fall of 2020, after we had been doing this gig for about 7 or 8 months, something like that. I was really involved here, stayed really involved here. I frequently came to meetings high, frequently. And I felt like if I hadn't, I wouldn't have made it back. Same with still, sometimes chairing my AA meetings. Like it felt weird. No one else was going to do it. Right. So I just wouldn't say certain things. Like I wasn't going to bullshit and be like, I've got this much time sober. I just stopped mentioning it and wanted to just keep going like I was going, because I was very isolated. My partner and I had both, my partner at the time, yeah, cats, we had both relapsed, and it was very lonely. It was a very lonely place because we did it together separately. I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't the bonding moment that you would think that might be able to be. It was very shameful because he had tenure, it was very shameful and very confusing. And a lot of the reason that I followed suit was this codependency that was just like suffocating. Like, oh, if I leave him when he tells me he's used, then what if he goes and goes into a shame spiral and starts using IV drugs? Maybe, just weed is fine. Because, he came to me one day and said, I've been smoking weed. And it was like, I don't know how to describe it. It was like my feet just, the rug was pulled out from under me because that's all I knew with him. Like we had not used before. Like it was so far out of something that I could envision. It wasn't the only lie. It wasn't even the biggest lie. Some of those I won't tell for legal reasons, but I will say that I had no idea how far in he was, and it made me kind of sad that he went through some of that alone too. But I became very withdrawn and went into a depression cycle that was dangerous, very dangerous, because marijuana for me is a depressant, and I was already depressed. And it started out as the CBD experiment and ended up with a lot of other things. And toward the end of it, it got really scary. And I'll say that some people know this part of the story, some people don't, and I don't have to go into much detail, but we had been dabbling with some hallucinogenics that made him psychotic and like really triggered an actual psychosis that he still is not, he's still healing from some of that. And I know that, but it like his brain broke and he became a person that I did not recognize and that I was afraid of. And we've been able to talk about that and we're okay with that today, but I share it because I think it's important to know that relapse happens, recurrence happens, however you want to put it. It doesn't have to happen, but it doesn't have to define you. And part of the reason I stayed in the relapse as long as I hate weed, like the fact that I was smoking it daily is ridiculous. Like when I could have been using all number of things. So thank God for that, right? It could have been so much worse. But also, I stayed connected. If I had not kept coming to these meetings and my AA meetings, fucked up or not, I would not be here. And I promise you. So that's another case for me of like, come as you are and meet people where the fuck they are. They may not even tell you where they are. Nobody even suspected that I was using. They knew I was depressed. But I don't know anybody that really could say, yeah, I suspected that was going on. And so I felt, when it came to the thing that scared us enough to scare us sober was that psychosis period. We still had to go on our own journey, and that was okay. And the worst hadn't even happened. The relapse, I mean, I won't speak for him, but I'll say that there was a lot of loss on both of our sides from our actions, and there's still some healing going on from that. And I felt like I had to get honest, and it was one of the scariest things. I don't know why, because I've done scarier shit, but one of the scariest things I ever did was to call Stephanie. One, because I felt like she looked up to me in a way that I always knew I didn't deserve. And I've always said that when people would kind of put me on this pedestal and I would be like, I'm just another fucking bozo on the bus. Like, really, I knew that deeply. But I know that that doesn't matter when you need hope, when you need to be able to look at somebody as some kind of example. I'm making you cry too. Good. So it was a really hard call because she was the first person I felt like I owed something to, because we had stayed close up to that time. And I mean, I documented, some of what was going on. I just couldn't explain why. So I wanted to put some context to it because I was really afraid. And I still have some like post-traumatic stress lingering from some of the fear I was in around some of what was going on and some of what I was afraid was going to happen, not just to myself, but to somebody else that I love and other people. So it was one of the most freeing things I ever did. Like the crazy thing is that the shame spiral will keep us in it longer. Just how ashamed we are and scared to come back and say, yeah, I fucked up, is sometimes the only reason we keep using. Like it's not necessary because it was not that big a deal. Like I mean, nobody was like, oh my God. But the part that I didn't like was that I knew that people, that I wasn't like, oh, I've relapsed and this is just where I'm at. Like I lied, hid it, came to meetings just intoxicated to the point where I felt very guilty. But that was what I felt most guilty about. It wasn't about that I relapsed at all. It was about that I was a fake. And that's why it's kind of interesting, the way that Stephanie wrote my promo, right? There's nothing fake, because I don't like being someone different in different spaces. I don't like it anymore. And that's why I couldn't bear it. And so it's part of why I'm alive today. And I'm grateful that I went through all that. I'm grateful that I still have a place to come when I want to. I'm grateful that I've been able to put some boundaries in place for myself that I've needed. And you know, that I've been able to be at least an example of, as Macklemore puts it, right, starting over. It's just not that big a deal. And I don't count days anymore. I have about 15 months, but I stopped counting days when I came back, because I just, for a while, it was because I couldn't come to terms with what I felt like I had given up. Which now I really remind people is just adding layers. I'm just adding layers. I didn't lose shit. You know, I didn't lose anything I know about recovery. I didn't lose anything that I've taught someone else. None of that was untrue. I didn't lose any of what I gained in recovery, except a date that ultimately, if you know me, I'm like, even holidays, they're just fucking holidays. Like, get over it, right? Like, it is what it is. It's just a date on a calendar. So I am proud of that time, but the growth that I've had to endure over the last year, like it stuns me to silence, that I might have missed that had I not gone through what I went through. Like, I'm my own person. I don't answer to anybody, ultimately, you know, and I have not ever lived my life like that, ever. My happiness does not depend on someone else's worth or their perception of my worth anymore. And I'll do what it takes to protect my peace. And today, I forgive, you know, I forgive the people all the way through my life that failed me. I forgive, you know, I forgive, you know, someone that is really one of my closest friends today, that was my partner, um, because I was there too, you know, who did worse and who did what. I mean, shit, we had restraining orders on each other at some point. Like, I don't know who was worse, but I do know that if I would not have made it through even that period of time that was, you know, catastrophic, had it not been for Steph and Jess and Steve, and, you know, I mean, I'm just naming off people in the room, but like people that were here sometimes for hours with me, listening to me like trauma dump so much of this, like I couldn't believe where my life was. Jeff, I mean, you know, just the conversations we could have where we could talk about some trauma, and then we could talk about some movie recommendations, and then we could, you know, like, there's no place like that. And Dopey has a very special place in my heart for many reasons, but one of them is that I know that I'm always free to come and go as I please. I wish people missed me more. I'm kidding. I sound like someone's grandmother, where I'm like, I wish you called more, but no, I still keep in touch. You know, I have friends that I still talk to today. Carter has had to accept that it may be 3 days before I even read a message, but once I'm on it, I'm on it. And Jess, you know, I mean, I've been able to meet dopes that drove, you know, just to make my birthday decent last year. Jess, you know, drove out with her family, and Liz Ann, you know, flew in, and you know, I had not, yeah, I don't know how to describe it. All I know is that I have a career that I wouldn't have had none of that happen. I have a sense of myself that I wouldn't trade for anything, and people that know me know, like, you're different, you know, like you're not the taking of shit or like thinking that I owe someone something is just not, I don't have it. It's not there. Like, I'm willing to give freely of any time I have, anything I have, any recovery I have, but I'm very comfortable in my boundaries today. And so when someone says, well, I don't want to reach out because I don't want to bother you, like, don't worry, you won't. I have good boundaries. Like, if I can't take the call, then I can't take the call, you know. But it didn't used to be like that. And what I've had to do to get there is amazing. And God, there's so much shit too. The last thing I'll say is something that should have gone somewhere else as a footnote. But I am trying to learn from different speaking things. One thing that I do wish were different was that I wish that everybody had the chance to recover. And um, one of the reasons, like, I knew that I couldn't just give up. Um, you know, I couldn't just give up was, you know, I mean, I lost my mother to this disease when I had 19 days sober in 2013. Like, if there was a reason to drink, it would have been then. But that was when I saw higher power for the first time in my life. That I got through that. Aaron didn't fucking do that because there were opiate, you know, I mean, I would have died if I had used to get through the pain of that. I would not be here because there's not enough drugs out there to deal with that kind of pain. The only thing that could have done that was a spiritual solution for me, was a spiritual solution. And people that had my fucking back from day one. And the fact that I didn't wait, you know, I didn't wait to get a sponsor in him and Han and want to get the right one. I got one. They said, get one, I got one. So I had one when my mom died. She died of an oxycodone benzo overdose that was thought to be intentional, but either way, she had been one of us in recovery for 13 years before she got hung up in the prescription meds and ultimately died from it. You know, she was like any of us in recovery doing that damn thing, and then she stopped doing the damn thing. So anyway, I hate to leave it on a sad note, but I feel like there's no way I can't mention my mom because she's with me always. And you know, I've never understood more how important it is to, whatever you have it authentically, than to know that, you know, I don't think my mom really experienced that in her life or got to, you know, she didn't get to grow like that. And we, you know, anyway, I have, and it's a gift that I don't have the right to just throw away, to have, you know. So anyway, I love everybody here, and as you guys know, I could talk all night, but I hope I hit the most important points. My story changes every time I tell it because our story changes. You know, the facts remain the same, but what we include in it changes, and I find it interesting. The things that vary and like parts that I just don't talk about different times, because it's whatever's on my heart. I don't write things down. I don't, you know, first time I went to speak somewhere, I wrote like my life story out. I was going to this AA meeting where I was speaking in front of like 100 people. I wrote my whole life story out, right? And I was like, this is what I'm going to say. And then when I got up there, I was like, fuck. And I just, you know, tossed it. And today I didn't even write bullet points, which I usually do, of like, hey, remember to mention this, or remember, because I don't give a fuck. I don't give a fuck. If it's what someone needed to hear, I hope so. And if it's an hour and a half that you wish you could have back, then I'll Venmo you. But thank you for letting me share copiously.